The courtroom smelled like old carpet and defeated expectations. Nora Aldridge had noticed that detail the moment she walked in, the way the air in rooms like this carries a particular weight, the accumulated residue of every broken agreement and shattered promise that has ever been presented before a judge in this county. The carpet was the color of dried mud. The fluorescent light above the defense table flickered every 40 seconds with the mechanical indifference of something that had stopped caring long ago. She had counted the flickers. It was the kind of thing you counted when the alternative was looking at what was happening at the table across the aisle. She was 62 years old. She had been married for 40 of those years. And she was sitting in a Denver courtroom on a gray Tuesday in November with a court-appointed lawyer beside her who had reviewed her case for the first time that morning. On the drive over, while across the mahogany divide, her husband of 4 decades sat flanked by 2 attorneys from the firm of Wexler and Associates, a legal team that billed at a rate that exceeded what Nora had been given to live on for the past 6 months. Grant Aldridge did not look at her. He had not looked at her, not directly, not in the way that means you are actually seeing the person in front of you for longer than she could precisely calculate. That was the thing about a slow erosion. You did not notice it happening. You only noticed at some point far down the line that something was gone, and then you tried to remember when exactly you had last seen it, and you could not find the date. The judge was a man in his late 50s with reading glasses pushed down his nose, and the particular expression of someone who has seen too many of these cases to find any of them remarkable. He was reviewing the settlement documents with his pen, moving in small, efficient circles, pausing occasionally to make a notation, his attention distributed between the papers and the large window behind the defense table that looked out over the gray November sky above downtown Denver. He looked like a man who had already decided this and was simply completing the paperwork. Wexler stood. He was a tall man, the kind of tall that had been cultivated through years of standing in front of judges and learning exactly how to fill a room with nothing but posture and diction. He had silver hair and a charcoal suit that fit with the precision of something chosen to communicate. That precision was non-negotiable. He began with the assets. The house on Garrison Street, 4 bedrooms, purchased in 1987 with the proceeds of Grant Aldridge's commercial real estate work. Current appraised value $1.4 million. The investment portfolio accumulated over 37 years of Grant Aldridge's professional activity, current value $2.2 million. The retirement accounts the business interest in Aldridge commercial properties, the 3 vehicles, the lake property in Summit County. Wexler moved through the list with the rhythm of a man reading inventory, each asset presented in the language of ownership, and in each presentation, the ownership was Grant's, earned by Grant, attributed to Grant. Nora listened to this recitation and thought about the morning in 1989 when she had turned down a position at a marketing firm in downtown Denver because Grant had a major client presentation that week, and someone needed to be at home with the children who were 4 and 7 at the time and could not be trusted to a sitter for an entire week. She thought about the client dinners she had organized, the way she had learned the names and preferences and family details of every significant relationship in Grant's professional life, so that she could speak to them personally when they came to the house, which they did, often because the Aldridge home was a place that made people feel welcomed, and it made people feel welcomed because Nora had spent 20 years perfecting exactly that. She thought about the conference in Aspen in 2003, where Grant had been presenting to a room full of investors, and she had spent the 3 days before it preparing his materials, his talking points, the bound summary documents she had designed and printed herself, working until 2 in the morning for 2 consecutive nights. She thought about the look on his face when the investors signed, the way he had turned to her across the crowded room and raised his glass. She had thought at the time that it was acknowledgement. She understood now that it had been something more proprietary than that. Wexler reached the conclusion of his asset summary and paused with the timing of a man who has practiced pauses. The record, he said, would demonstrate that the marital estate was the product of Mr. Aldridge's professional contributions over 4 decades of business activity. Mrs. Aldridge's role, while admirable in many respects, had been that of a homemaker. There was no professional income, no independent financial contribution to the marital estate. The settlement proposed by Mr. Aldridge's team was, in Wexler's assessment, generous in light of that reality. Generous. Nora had been in this country long enough to understand that when lawyers used the word generous, they meant the opposite. They meant, we have given you slightly more than nothing, and we would like credit for the nothing. Her own lawyer, a young man named Fitch, who had the nervous energy of someone who had not yet learned that composure was more useful than anxiety, leaned toward her and whispered that she should think about the offer, that fighting it would cost more than it would gain, that the courts in this state did not often rule favorably for homemakers in cases where the earning spouse had established clear documentation of financial contribution. Nora did not respond to him. She was looking at Grant. He was whispering something to Wexler, something that produced a small movement at the corner of Wexler's mouth that was not quite a smile, but was in the same neighborhood. Tatum, who was seated in the gallery row directly behind Grant, leaned forward slightly at this exchange with the attentive posture of someone who has decided to participate in a performance she did not earn admission to. Tatum was 32 years old. She had the kind of appearance that required investment in maintenance, the result not of natural effortlessness, but of considerable deliberate effort deployed to create the appearance of effortlessness. She was wearing a dress that Nora could estimate the cost of within $50. She touched Grant's shoulder once briefly with the proprietary ease of someone marking territory they considered already secured. Nora looked at her for exactly as long as she needed to, which was not long, and then she looked at the window behind the judge's bench and the gray sky beyond it. She thought about a Tuesday morning in October of 1984, 3 weeks after the wedding, when she had woken at 5:30 to take a phone call from a contractor who was furious about materials delays on one of Grant's projects. Grant had been asleep. She had taken the call. She had resolved the problem calmly and methodically over 40 minutes of negotiation, and then she had made coffee and left a summary note on the kitchen counter and not woken Grant until 7, because he needed the sleep before a full day of site visits. She had never mentioned the call. It was not the kind of thing you mentioned when you were building a life together with someone. You simply handled what needed handling because that was the work. 40 years of that kind of work. And Wexler was calling it admirable, and the judge was making small circles with his pen. There is one additional property, Wexler said. He said it the way you add a footnote to a document that is already finished. The phrasing of an afterthought, even though nothing in a prepared legal statement is an afterthought. A cabin, located in the San Juan Mountains approximately 160 miles southwest of Denver, inherited by Mr. Aldridge from his father Harlan Aldridge some 20 years prior. The property had been assessed for tax purposes at a value consistent with its condition, which was Wexler allowed considerably deteriorated. No utilities, no road access of any standard variety, no recent habitation. The structure itself had not been assessed as inhabitable by current code. Mr. Aldridge, Wexler continued, was prepared to deed this property to Mrs. Aldridge as a gesture of goodwill. Fitch looked at Nora with the expression of a man unsure whether to recommend acceptance of something that might be a gift or might be a trap. He whispered something about the tax liability on a distressed property. She was not listening to him. She was watching Grant. He had turned slightly in his chair, just enough to indicate that he was aware of her watching him without having to commit to actually meeting her gaze. There was a particular self-satisfaction in the angle of his shoulders that she recognized from 40 years of reading him. It was the satisfaction of a man who has arranged things exactly as he intended them, who has placed a final piece with precision and is waiting for the effect to register. "Fine," Nora said. Her voice was steady. It surprised her, that steadiness. She had not known in advance what her voice would do. Fitch looked at her with the expression of someone who has just watched a person accept a parking ticket when they might have argued against it. The judge's gavel came down with the decisive sound of something becoming permanent. The session was concluded. The proceedings of dissolution of the marriage of Grant Allen Aldridge and Eleanor Margaret Aldridge were finalized. The bailiff was already looking at the door. Nora gathered the folder in front of her, which contained copies of documents that described the precise mathematical calculation of what 40 years of her life had produced in terms that the court could recognize. She placed the folder in her bag. She stood. She adjusted the collar of her coat. She had worn this coat to every meeting with Fitch. It was a good coat wool purchased 15 years ago, maintained carefully. It was the kind of coat that lasted because someone had taken care of it. She was walking toward the back of the courtroom when she heard him. Grant had risen and was speaking to Tatum in a low voice, but the acoustics of the room did what the acoustics of such rooms do. carrying sound with an impartiality that does not distinguish between words meant to be private and words meant to carry. He was talking about dinner, celebrating. He mentioned a restaurant in Cherry Creek that Tatum had been wanting to try. And then with the ease of a man who has rehearsed this, or perhaps with the ease of a man who has not needed to rehearse it because this kind of thing comes naturally to him, Grant raised his voice just slightly and directed it toward the retreating figure of his ex-wife. "Enjoy the cabin, Nora," he said. He said it with the warmth of a man extending genuine good wishes, which was the precise register that made it something else entirely. Tatum laughed. It was a light social laugh, the laugh of someone who has been cued to laugh. It was not loud. It did not need to be loud to accomplish what it was designed to accomplish. Nora did not stop walking. She reached the door at the back of the courtroom, pushed it open, passed through it, and let it close behind her. She walked down the corridor with its gray carpet and its fluorescent lights and its bulletin boards pinned with notices and its smell of institutional air and document storage. She walked past the elevator and took the stairs because the stairs were faster and she did not want to wait. She walked through the lobby with its security desk and its metal detectors and its American flag in the corner, looking slightly faded. She pushed through the heavy glass door and went out into the November air. It was cold. The sky above downtown Denver was the flat white of a day that had committed to overcast from the beginning and had no intention of reconsidering. Her breath made small plumes. She walked to her car, which was a 2009 Honda Accord in a shade of silver that had become dingy over the years in a way that good maintenance could not fully address. She had been meaning to get it washed. She unlocked it and sat down and closed the door. For a long moment, she did not do anything. The parking garage around her was concrete and echoed and smelled of exhaust and cold. A car pulled out of a space 2 rows down. A couple walked past with their heels clicking on the painted concrete. A pigeon that had found its way into the garage was sitting on a beam above the adjacent car and regarding this situation with the philosophical detachment of pigeons. Nora put her hands on the steering wheel. 40 years, not just the marriage, the work, the daily invisible work of being the ground that someone else built on. The phone calls handled before he was awake. The meals prepared for people whose names she had memorized specifically so they would feel remembered. The school events attended alone because he was traveling again, the explanation already prepared for whatever teacher or parent asked where her husband was. The children raised to be people worth knowing, 2 of them, Beckett and Sloan, now in their 30s, now living their own lives, which meant that the work she had done to produce those lives had achieved its intended result, which was to make itself unnecessary. The sound of Tatum's laugh was still present in some register she could not turn down. She sat there for 7 minutes. She knew it was 7 minutes because she watched the clock on the dash. And then she took out the piece of paper that Fitch had given her before the session ended, the deed to the property in the San Juan Mountains, which had been printed that morning and bore the address of a place she had never been, and a property description that used the phrase "no improvements of value" 3 separate times. She read it through once. She folded it carefully along the pre-existing crease. She put it in the interior pocket of her coat. Then she started the car. She called Beckett first because Beckett was the one who had been in the courthouse that morning, who had come to offer support in the specific way of someone who has offered support before and found it declined, which meant his support had taken the form of sitting in the gallery for the first 30 minutes and then quietly leaving when it became clear that his presence was not reducing his mother's composure. He answered on the second ring. She told him that it was done. She told him the terms without editorial comment, the way you read a document aloud when the document is what it is, and there is nothing to be gained by adding your opinion of it. She heard his breathing shift when she described the settlement structure, the particular breath of someone absorbing information they find objectionable, but do not know how to object to. "Mom," he said, "you can stay with us. Harper and I already talked about it. The kids would love having you, and we have the room and I have the cabin," Nora said. There was a pause. Beckett was a thoughtful pauser. He had been since he was a boy this habit of creating a small space between information and response, as though he needed to check the information against something internal before deciding how to hold it. "Dad said that place is in bad shape," Beckett said carefully. "Your father also said I hadn't contributed anything of value to 40 years of marriage," Nora replied. "I've been wrong to take his assessments at face value before." Another pause, shorter this time. Where are you now, he asked. Parking garage. Level 2. I'm still in the building, he said. I can come. I'm going to drive home and pack, Nora said. I'll call you when I get to the cabin. She could hear the tension in his silence, the particular quality of a son wanting to say something that his sense of his mother's autonomy was preventing him from saying. She knew that feeling of his could identify it by its exact texture. She had 40 years of learning the silences of the people around her. I love you, she said, and she meant it with the full weight of what it meant. Then she ended the call. She called Sloan next. Sloan had not come to the courthouse. This was not indifference. Sloan had explained 2 weeks ago that she couldn't bear to watch, that she would find it too hard to be in the same room as her father and not say things that would make everything worse. Nora had understood that. Sloan's instinct for saying things that made everything worse was a quality she had always secretly admired. Sloan answered and Nora told her, and Sloan's response was immediate and characteristically direct. He gave you a cabin, she said, as a settlement. One cabin, as a gesture of goodwill, Nora said. The sound Sloan made was not quite a word, but communicated everything that any word would have communicated, and several things that no polite word could. Come here, Sloan said. The apartment has a couch that folds out, and it's actually comfortable. Derek slept on it when he visited in September, and he didn't complain once, which for Derek means it was basically a 4-star hotel experience. I'm going to the cabin, Nora said. Sloan was quiet for a moment. Mom Renee Blackwood tried to stay in a mountain cabin one winter after her divorce, and she had to be airlifted out in February because of the propane situation. I appreciate that information, Nora said. I'll call you when I get there. She drove home. The house on Garrison Street was a 4-bedroom colonial that she had spent 23 years making into something that was genuinely a home, the kind of home that required continuous and specific effort to maintain as a home rather than simply a house. She had a week. Grant's calendar, which she was no longer entitled to know, apparently had Tatum in it for the weekend, which meant she had 7 days to reduce 40 years of accumulated life to whatever would fit in a 2009 Accord. She was not sentimental about the process in the way she had expected to be. She had imagined in the months leading up to this that packing would be an emotional excavation, each item requiring a decision about memory and identity and what you carried forward from a life you were leaving. It was not that, it was logistics. Clothes, documents, photographs, the things that were hers in a way that predated the marriage. The kitchen items her mother had given her, the books she had actually read, not the ones on the shelves that had been purchased for the appearance of a certain kind of person living in this house. She worked through the house with a systematic efficiency that she recognized as a version of the same quality that had made her effective at all the invisible work she had done here. She assessed, she decided, she packed. She was not slow, and she did not stop to grieve specific items. The grief was not for the things were just things. The grief, if she was being precise about it, was for the assumption of reciprocity that she had carried through 40 years without ever examining closely enough to test. She had assumed that the work she did was understood. That was the thing she had gotten wrong, not the work itself, which had been real and substantial and had produced real and substantial results, but the assumption that its value was visible to the person who had benefited most from it. She packed 4 boxes and 3 suitcases and 2 duffel bags. She loaded the car in 2 trips. On the second trip, she paused in the kitchen and looked at the space one more time. The kitchen she had designed during a renovation in 2008. The countertops she had selected after visiting 11 showrooms over 2 months. The way the morning light came through the window above the sink and fell across the stone in a way that she had always found genuinely beautiful every morning for 16 years. She turned off the kitchen light and walked out. She did not look back at the house as she drove away. She called the utility companies from the road, and she stopped for gas at a station outside Castle Rock, and she ate a gas station sandwich that was unremarkable in every particular, and she drank coffee from a paper cup that was too hot for the first 20 minutes, and then too cold for the last 20. And she drove southwest on I-25, and then onto Route 160, and then off Route 160 onto state roads that became progressively less maintained and progressively more honest about what the terrain out here actually was. The mountains came up around her gradually, and then all at once, the way mountains do when you have been in flat country for long enough that you have started to forget they exist. And then the road curves, and there they are, immediate and unreasonable in their scale. The San Juans in November showing their serious face, the high peaks carrying the first of the season's snow above the tree line, the lower slopes dark with spruce and the silver of bare aspen, and the particular quality of winter, light in high country that is not warm and does not pretend to be. She had printed the directions that morning. The property was listed at an address that her phone's navigation system was willing to acknowledge existed but somewhat reluctant to route her toward with any confidence. She followed the state road to a county road, the county road to a gravel road, the gravel road to what the directions called a private access track, which was the polite term for two parallel ruts through barrier-grown scrub grass that indicated a vehicle had come this way at some point in the past, possibly recently, possibly not. She drove the Accord carefully and slowly, the suspension making comments about the terrain that she acknowledged and ignored. The sign appeared around a curve nailed to a pine tree at a height that suggested someone of reasonable height had put it there without a ladder. The paint was faded, the wood weathered to the gray of old driftwood, but the words were still legible. Aldrich property, no trespassing. Nora stopped the car and read it. The irony arrived with her settled beside her in the seat, and she let it sit there for a moment. She had been Eleanor Calloway for 22 years before she became Eleanor Aldridge, and she had been Eleanor Aldridge for 40 years, and now, by the mechanics of the legal proceeding she had just left, she was in the process of deciding what Eleanor Aldridge meant, or whether it still meant anything at all, or whether the name was something she carried forward or something she set down with everything else that was no longer hers. The sign said Aldrich. She drove past it. The track continued for another quarter-mile through trees that grew progressively closer to its edges, branches occasionally brushing the car's mirrors, with the tentative reach of something checking whether you were really going through with this. And then the trees opened, and she was in a clearing, and the cabin was in front of her. Grant had called it dilapidated. She had thought when he said it in the courtroom that this was relative, that there was a range within the word dilapidated from unfortunate but workable to genuinely unlivable, and she had hoped the cabin fell somewhere in the former category. She sat in the car and looked at it. The structure was a log cabin, small perhaps 800 square feet by her estimate, positioned against a rocky slope with its back to the mountain in a way that someone had clearly intended to provide shelter from the prevailing wind. That intention remained. The structure's relationship to that intention, however, had been complicated by approximately 30 years of deferred maintenance. The porch that ran across the front had partially collapsed on the left side, the support beam rotted through at its base, and the deck planking sagging into a V-shape that was interesting from an engineering perspective and not usable from any other. Several of the windows were broken, their frames still holding the remnants of old glass in points and shards like bad teeth. The roof was the main concern visually. The center ridge showed a pronounced sag that indicated either water damage or structural failure, or quite possibly both. Vines and moss had taken significant territory on the north and east faces, the kind of coverage that happens when something has been left untended for long enough that the forest has begun the process of reclaiming it. The door was standing slightly open. Nora sat in the car for a while. She thought about the spare room in Beckett's house, which she had seen twice, which was comfortable and warm, and had a window that looked out over the backyard where his children played on weekends. She thought about the fold-out couch in Sloane's apartment and the specific comfort of being in the same city as people who cared about what happened to you. She thought about the sound of Tatum's laugh in the courtroom. She got out of the car. The November air in the mountains was a different category of cold than Denver cold. It was honest in a way that city cold was not. It went straight to the point without any of the urban mediation of buildings and bodies and exhaust heat. It was the cold of altitude and open sky and the kind of quiet that exists in places where there are no machines running. A bird called somewhere in the trees to the east, a high, clean note that the air carried exactly. The smell was pine and stone and the dry, cold sweetness of high country just at the edge of winter. She walked toward the cabin. She tested the porch steps before committing to them, pressing with one foot and holding herself in readiness to redistribute her weight. The bottom step was solid. The second step held. She stepped around the collapsed section on the left and reached the door and pushed it further open. The smell came out to meet her, mold certainly and decay, in the particular smell of a space that has not had air moving through it in a long time, and below that deeper, the smell of old wood an old stone and old ash from a fireplace that had last been lit before most of the current decade. She paused at the threshold and let her eyes adjust. One large main room, a kitchen area along the right wall, or what had been a kitchen area, now a space with the ghost of a counter and the outline of where appliances had once stood. A stone fireplace on the far wall running from floor to ceiling, built from the same gray granite as the slope behind the cabin, massive and serious and permanent looking, in a way that everything else in the room was not. A loft space accessible by a ladder in the left corner, the loft itself not visible from this angle. The floor was wide plank pine, or had been once. Now it was partially rotted through in the center of the room where water had been coming in through the roof, and the boards there had gone soft and black and were not advisable to stand on. Nora stood in the doorway and looked at it. She was not a contractor. She had no professional training in construction or restoration or structural assessment. What she had was 40 years of managing a household that included 3 significant renovation projects, all of which she had overseen in their entirety, which meant she had spent a considerable amount of time understanding what contractors were telling her and translating it into decisions. She knew the vocabulary of structures. She knew what failure looked like, and more usefully, she knew what it looked like beneath failure. She looked at the walls. The logs were old-growth timber, the kind they did not cut anymore, each one 2 feet in diameter, straight and dense. Where the mold had not penetrated the wood was still dark and hard. The chinking between the logs was compromised, in places missing in others, but the logs themselves were not structural failures. They were not rotted through. They were simply unprotected. She looked at the floor. The rot was localized. The boards around the edges of the room, away from the water intrusion zone, were still solid. She walked carefully around the perimeter, testing as she went, and found that probably 60% of the floor was still sound. She looked at the roof situation from inside, tilting her head back to assess the sag above the center. There was daylight visible through 2 places where the roofing material had failed. The sag was concerning, but it was not catastrophic. The ridge beam was still in place. This was a repair problem, not a replace problem. She walked to the fireplace. Up close, it was even more impressive than it had appeared from the doorway. The stones had been selected and fitted with real care, the kind of care that takes time and knowledge and an eye for how things go together. Whoever had built this had known what they were doing. Each stone was placed to bear weight efficiently, the joints staggered in a pattern that distributed load rather than concentrating it. The mortar in the joints was failing in places, crumbling to dust at the edges, but the structure behind the mortar was sound. She ran her hand along the face of the firebox and looked up into the flue, which appeared clear. No obstruction that she could see in the column of gray light coming down from above. She looked at the mantel, a single thick slab of granite set into the stone on iron brackets, the surface of it dusty and cobwebbed but solid. And then in the left corner of the firebox face, at approximately eye level, she saw it. The letters were not decorative. They had been cut into the stone with a tool, carefully, the chisel marks still clean, after however many decades, each letter incised with the deliberate permanence of someone who intended this to last. 2 words, Harlan Aldridge. She stood very still. She knew the name in the way you know the names of people you have been told about, but never asked about, peripherally a reference point in Grant's family history that she had encountered in passing and not pressed on. Harlan Aldridge had been Grant's father, who had died before their marriage, who had left a modest estate that included some personal effects and this property, and about whom Grant had said, whenever the subject arose, which was rarely, that his father had been a difficult man, and he preferred not to discuss him. She had accepted that. She had accepted a great many things over the years on the basis that they were not her business, that respecting someone's privacy about their own family history was a form of love. She had perhaps mistaken in curiosity for respect. Harlan Aldridge, not a claim of ownership in the legal sense, not a date, not a deed notation, just a name cut into the stone of a fireplace that someone had built with their own hands in a cabin at the end of a track in the mountains, in a place that seemed designed to be as far from other people as a person could reasonably get, while still maintaining a structure with 4 walls. Why build here, she thought. Not accusingly, not as a criticism, genuinely. There was no town nearby, no river, no road of consequence, no feature of the land that obviously recommended it as a building site over 1,000 other possible sites in these mountains. You came here deliberately, You chose this. She filed the question in the same careful way she had filed thousands of pieces of information over 40 years. Not dismissed, not resolved. Held. She walked back to the main room and assessed what she had. The structure was not the disaster that a first impression suggested. The disaster was the surface layer, the 30 years of deferred maintenance and weather intrusion, and the specific neglect of a property that had been regarded as worthless by someone who had not looked at it carefully enough to know what it was worth. Beneath that layer, the bones were solid. The logs were still there, still dense and hard. The foundation was stone and appeared level. The fireplace was intact. The loft floor, when she tested it with 1 foot from the third rung of the ladder, held her weight without complaint. This was a building that had been abandoned, not a building that had failed. There was a difference. She understood the difference. She had spent 40 years taking things that had been abandoned and returning them to function. She went back to the car and carried in the sleeping bag and the duffel bag with the essentials she had packed in Denver, the things she would need immediately. She swept the debris off the section of floor near the fireplace that appeared most solid using a broom she found hanging on a hook by the kitchen area that was remarkable in its continued existence. She laid the sleeping bag down. She found wood stacked under a tarp on the east side of the cabin's exterior, dry wood probably 2 or 3 years old based on its color, but adequately dry, protected from the worst of the weather by the tarp's remnants. She carried 6 pieces inside. She built the fire carefully using newspaper she had bought at the gas station in Pagosa Springs, layering the kindling in the pattern her father had taught her when she was 7 years old, and they had gone camping in northern Minnesota, the only camping trip she could remember taking the summer before 3rd grade. She had not thought about that camping trip in probably 20 years. She thought about it now as her hands arranged the kindling, the memory arriving complete and specific, the smell of that campfire, the sound of the lake at night, her father's patient instruction about how to build a fire that would catch and hold. The fire took on the 3rd match. The chimney drew cleanly, the smoke rising straight up into the flue, with the cooperative efficiency of a system that had been built correctly and remembered how to work when asked. The firelight spread across the stone of the fireplace and reached into the corners of the room and found the grain of the old pine logs and the particular color of granite in firelight, which is not gray at all but amber and brown and the dark red of deep earth. It was warm. Within 20 minutes, the area near the fireplace was genuinely warm, the stone of the firebox face beginning to absorb the heat and prepare to return it. Nora sat on the floor with her back against the stone and her sleeping bag pulled around her shoulders and looked at the room in the firelight. This was it. This was what she had at the end of 40 years. A cabin in the San Juan Mountains that the legal system of the state of Colorado had assessed as having no improvements of value. A sleeping bag in a duffel bag in a 2009 Accord with 214,000 miles on it. A deed with her name on it for the first time in her adult life. Any deed, any property, anything with her name on it. The fire made the sound that fires make, the low, persistent sound of wood becoming heat, the occasional pop of moisture trapped in the grain, releasing the quiet voice of combustion. Nora Aldrich sat in the warmth of a fire she had built herself in a room that was hers, and the night outside was very dark and very cold, and the mountains did not care about any of it, which was, she found, a comfort she had not expected to find in anything. She cried, not loudly, not dramatically. She did not song or keen or make the sounds that grief is supposed to make according to its performance in movies and television. She simply cried steadily and quietly, the tears coming without effort, in the way that things come when there is no longer any reason to hold them back. 40 years of assumption, 40 years of trust distributed without asking whether the distribution was being received. 40 years of being the ground rather than the structure, and the structure was gone now. And she was sitting on the ground alone, and the ground was cold stone, and her name was on the deed. She let herself cry for as long as it took. She did not time it. She did not interrupt it. She gave it the space it required, which was not as large a space as she had feared, and when it was done, she found that something had clarified on the other side of it, some reduction of noise, the way the air is clearer after rain. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her coat. She reached into the duffel bag and found the small notebook she had put in at the last minute, a habit of 40 years. The notebook always in the bag because there was always something to track, always a list to be made or a sequence to be planned. She found the pen clipped to its cover. She opened to the first page. She wrote cabin across the top. Then below it, she began a list, not of what was wrong, of what needed to be done, which was different because what needed to be done was addressable, and what was wrong was simply the distance between where something was and where it needed to go, and distance was something you covered by moving, and she had always been good at moving. Roof assessment, source of water, generator or solar, floor repair zones, window replacement, chinking, insulation. She wrote until the pen caught up with her thinking, and then she wrote some more. The fire burned steadily through the night, and the stone held its warmth, and outside the mountains were silent, under the November stars in the way of things that have been here for a very long time, and will be here for a very long time more, and have no opinion about the small dramas of the human lives that occasionally appear at their feet. In the morning, Nora Aldridge would get up, make coffee on the camp stove she had packed, and begin. Not because she had chosen resilience as a concept, not because she had decided to be inspiring, but because the list was written and the tasks were real and there was work to be done, and she had never in 40 years left work undone simply because it was hard. In the parking garage of the Denver courthouse, approximately 3 hours after the session had concluded, a man had sat in a gray pickup truck for 40 minutes looking in the direction his mother's car had gone. He had not gone in. He had not called. He had finally started the engine and driven to a hardware store on his way home and purchased a canvas bag and filled it with basic tools, a hammer, a pry bar, a good utility knife, a box of heavy-duty garbage bags. He had driven back through the city in the November dark and then north to his house in Thornton, where his wife had dinner waiting and his kids wanted to tell him about school, and he had been present for all of it in the way that you are present for the things that matter, while something else is also present in the back of your mind, traveling a dark mountain road in an old silver car. He had not told anyone about the bag. He had put it in the back of his truck, and he had left it there. The first week was an education in the specific vocabulary of a building that had been left to its own devices for 30 years. Every structure has a language. Nora had learned this through 3 renovation projects in the house on Garrison Street, through years of managing contractors and walking job sites and asking the kind of questions that forced people to explain rather than summarize. She had learned that buildings communicated their conditions clearly if you knew how to listen, that the sounds a floor made under your weight told you something specific, that the quality of cold air coming through a wall told you something else, that the pattern of water staining on a ceiling was a map of failures that could be read like a document if you had the patience to read it. The cabin had a great deal to say. She began at the roof, which was the most urgent conversation. She had found a ladder on the second morning, collapsed and rusted in the brush, along the north face of the building, and she had straightened it and tested each rung before trusting it. The roof was worse in the center and better at the edges than she had assessed from inside. 2 sections of the original cedar shake roofing had failed entirely, the wood gone soft and black, and these were the sources of the water intrusion that had destroyed the floor section below. The ridge beam itself was intact. The structural rafters were intact. The problem was localized, which meant it was solvable. She drove the 40 minutes to Garrison, the nearest town of any consequence, on her 3rd morning. It was a small mountain community with a gas station and a diner and a post office and a hardware and building supply store that occupied a long, low building at the edge of town with a parking lot that held 3 trucks in various stages of work, use, and a hand-lettered sign in the window that said open most days. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his mid-50s, solid and unhurried, with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have spent their lives in places where rushing is understood to be counterproductive. His name tag said Dearborn. No first name, just Dearborn, which seemed to suit him precisely. She set a list on the counter. Roofing materials, cedar shake quantity calculated for the area she needed to cover. Chinking compound. Mold remediation products, the serious kind. Plastic sheeting, heavy gauge. Window repair materials. Dearborn read through the list without comment, the way a man reads a document when he is deciding whether it is accurate rather than whether it is appropriate. Big project, he said. Reclaiming what's mine, Nora said. She had not planned to say it that way. It came out with the quiet certainty of something that was simply true. Dearborn looked at her for a moment with the flat assessment of someone deciding how to calibrate their response. Then he nodded once, turned, and began pulling materials. He did not offer unsolicited advice. He did not suggest she might want to hire someone for the structural work. He did not make the particular kind of eye contact that means I am skeptical of your ability to accomplish what you have described. He pulled her materials and helped her load the truck she had rented for the day and gave her a price that was fair and told her that if she needed anything that wasn't on the list, she could call and he would put it aside. She thanked him and drove back up the mountain. The mold was the first real work. She had watched 3 tutorial videos on her phone the night before, lying in the sleeping bag in the firelight with the phone propped against the duffel bag, watching a man in Ohio demonstrate the process of mold remediation on a bathroom wall with the patient detail of someone who had done this enough times to understand that the person watching had probably never done it at all. She had taken notes in the same notebook where she had written her task list. She had asked herself the question she had learned to ask herself in the first year of managing the Garrison Street renovations, which was, what does this require that I don't currently have, and how do I get it? What mold remediation required was a respirator, industrial-grade cleaner, patience, and the willingness to do the same motion repeatedly for a long time without expecting rapid visible results. She had all of these. She started on the kitchen wall. It was the worst section, the mold having penetrated deep into the surface layer of the chinking and into the outer inch of the log, faces the kind of infestation that had been building slowly and without resistance for years. She worked in sections, applying the solution and letting it sit for the prescribed time, and then scrubbing, and the work was exactly as tedious and physically demanding as the tutorial had suggested, her arms aching with the repetitive motion by mid-morning, the respirator making her breath loud and close in her ears. But the wall responded. That was the thing she had not expected, not exactly, even though she had known intellectually that it would. The wall responded to the work. The dark surface of the mold retreated under the cleaner, and the scrubbing and revealed beneath it the original surface of the log, dark gold and brown in the way of old-growth timber, the grain running in the long patterns of slow growth in coal country. It was not new wood. It was not the wood of something that had not suffered, but it was the wood itself, the actual material that the building was made of, and it was there and it was still good. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and by the time the light through the repaired windows had shifted to the low angle of late afternoon in the mountains in December, she had covered the full expanse of the kitchen wall. She stepped back and looked at it. The surface was not beautiful. It was clean and treated and still showed the evidence of what had happened to it. But the structure was exposed and honest, and it was clear looking at it now that this wall was not going anywhere. It had been built to stay, and it was staying, and she had cleaned 40 years of neglect off its face, and what was underneath was still worth having. Nora pulled down the respirator and looked at the wall. She was aware in a way that did not require analysis that she was not only looking at a wall. She continued the mold work over the following 3 days, moving methodically through the main room and into the loft space, which she had accessed on the second full day, and found to be structurally sound and surprisingly spacious, a low-ceilinged room that ran the full width of the cabin with a window at each end. The north window looked out over the slope that backed up against the rocky rise above the cabin. The south window looked down through the clearing and into the tree line below. Both were broken. Both were bordered by window frames that, once she had cleared the debris from them, proved to be solid timber in good condition. She ordered replacement glass from Dearborn, who sourced it from a supplier in Durango, and had it ready in 4 days. And she installed it herself, following a tutorial with the focused attention of someone who has decided that the thing they are learning is worth learning properly. The floor repair came next. She pulled the rotted boards from the water intrusion zone in the center of the main room, working with the pry bar and her own weight, and found the subfloor beneath in partial condition, salvageable in sections requiring replacement in others. She spent 2 days on the floor, cutting new boards to length and fitting them, the fit not perfect, the lines not quite as straight as a professional would have made them, but solid and level and done. It was while she was working on the last section of floor replacement on her knees with a pry bar, working a stubborn piece of the old subfloor, that she first heard it. She had been kneeling in the kitchen area, which she had been systematically restoring over the past week, reworking the counter surface and assessing what could be salvaged from the cabinet frames. The kitchen occupied the right wall of the main room, its back wall being the exterior north face of the cabin. She had scrubbed this wall thoroughly during the mold work and knew its surface in the detailed way. You know, a surface you have spent time cleaning. She put her hand against the lower portion of the back wall of the kitchen to brace herself as she leaned to get better leverage on the subfloor board. She knocked. The sound was wrong, not wrong in the way of failure, not the hollow sound of compromised material. Wrong in the way of a space where there should not be a space, the acoustic signature of a void behind a surface, the difference between a note and its echo. She stopped. She put her knuckles against the wall and knocked again, moving 6 inches to the left. Solid. The log face returned its sound with the dull density of 20 inches of old-growth timber. She moved back to the original spot and knocked. The hollow note returned definitive, unmistakable once you had heard it. She looked at the wall section more carefully. The boards here were slightly different from the surrounding wall. Not dramatically, not in a way that would register on a casual inspection. But she had been looking at this wall for 2 weeks now, had cleaned every inch of it, had developed a familiarity with its details. And the boards in this section had a different quality of aging, a slightly different grain orientation, as though they had been installed at a different time than the surrounding boards, or had come from a different source. There was also, she noticed now, that she was looking specifically a difference in the chinking joints. The original chinking around most of the cabin's interior had a characteristic texture and color, the work of whoever had finished the building originally. The chinking around this section was the same material, but had a slightly different application pattern, as though someone had rechunked this section specifically not as part of a general repair job, but as a targeted intervention. Someone had opened this wall, and someone had closed it again. And they had done it well enough that 30 years of weather and neglect had not revealed the intervention. But they had not done it well enough to fool the person who had spent 2 weeks learning the vocabulary of this particular building. Nora sat back on her heels and looked at the section of wall. Then she got up and got the pry bar. She worked carefully, not with the tearing urgency of someone who has abandoned caution in the excitement of discovery, but with the deliberate attention of someone who understands that you can destroy what you are trying to find if you go at it wrong. She inserted the pry bar at the seam of the first board and applied steady pressure, not leverage, just pressure, easing the board away from its neighbors by fractions of an inch until the fasteners gave way and the board came free cleanly. Behind it was darkness. She took her flashlight from her work belt and held it toward the opening. A space, framed in timber approximately 2 feet deep and 3 feet wide, running from the cabin floor to a height of about 4 feet. The framing was deliberate, purposeful. This was not an accident of construction, not a gap left by an error in the building process. Someone had built this space intentionally, had framed it in and closed it off and rechunked the exterior with the intention of concealing it. The floor of the space was clean, dry earth, and on the floor of the space in the corner nearest the remaining wall boards was a box. It was wooden cedar approximately the size of a large document case, the kind of cedar that resisted moisture and insects in the slow, patient work of decay. The wood of it was still clean and tight, the joints still snug, the surface of it a warm reddish brown in the flashlight beam that contrasted with the gray and dark of everything that had surrounded it for however many decades it had been in here. Nora crouched in front of the space and looked at the box without touching it. Someone had hidden this deliberately. Someone had built a concealed space in the wall of a cabin in the San Juan Mountains, had placed something inside it that they wanted to protect, had sealed it up with the workmanship of a person who expected the concealment to last. The chinking work on the exterior boards was careful work, the work of someone who had enough patience to do it properly. She thought about the name cut into the stone of the fireplace. Harlan Aldridge. She reached in and took the box. It was heavier than she expected. Not heavy in the way of solid objects, but heavy in the way of accumulated things, the weight of density and collection. She carried it to the kitchen counter and set it down. The latch was a simple iron catch, the kind used on document boxes and tool chests in the 19th century, still functional, despite everything. She pressed the catch and lifted the lid. The smell came first. Cedar and oil and something old. The particular smell of documents that have been sealed away from air for a long time. A smell that belonged to archives and libraries and the private records of people who kept their important things in specific places. Inside the lid in handwriting that was firm and angular and clearly belonged to someone who had been educated in an era when handwriting was taught as a skill worth having were 2 lines. Property of H.W. Aldridge. For the family. when the time comes. Nora read the lines twice. Then she looked at the contents. The main body of the box held documents. They were wrapped in oilcloth separately in bundles that had been tied with string, the knots still tight, the oilcloth still pliable, still doing its intended work of protecting against moisture. Beside the document bundles was a cloth bag, drawstring closed, and inside the bag, when she loosened the drawstring and looked, were samples. Rocks, fragments of stone, several labeled in the same handwriting as the lid inscription, labeled with numbers and notations that she did not immediately understand, and a small glass bottle sealed with dark wax containing perhaps 2 ounces of liquid. She took the document bundles one at a time and unwrapped them in the order she found them. The first bundle was deeds. Property records for the land she was standing on, going back to an original claim registration dated August of 1889, when a man named Harlan Wesley Aldridge had formally registered a mineral claim on 40 acres of land in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado. The description matched the property in the settlement document, the same acreage, the same approximate coordinates. A mineral claim. She set this down and took the next bundle, analysis records. She read them slowly, going back over sections she did not immediately understand, building her comprehension of what she was looking at the way she had always built comprehension, carefully and without rushing. The records documented water samples taken from a natural spring on the property. The samples had been analyzed by a chemist in Denver, the letterhead still legible, dated 1891. The analysis reported mineral content, and what it reported was not ordinary. High concentrations of sulfate and calcium and magnesium, significant levels of silica. The kind of mineral profile the chemist's letter noted in language that was careful and scientific, that was associated with the therapeutic springs of Europe, the basis for the spa resorts of Germany and Austria and Hungary that were drawing wealthy visitors from across the continent. The chemist had used the phrase of exceptional therapeutic promise. Nora read that phrase 3 times. She set down the analysis records and took the next bundle. Engineering drawings, carefully rendered the work of a professional hand. A bathhouse designed to be built over and around the spring, 3 soaking rooms, a reception area, a small residence for a caretaker. The style was of its era, but the design was practical and considered the kind of design produced by someone who had thought about function and not only appearance. The drawings were dated 1892. Then letters, from investors in Denver and Santa Fe, from a builder in Durango, from a physician in Colorado Springs who had written with considerable enthusiasm about the therapeutic properties of mineral bathing and the growing market for such facilities in the American West. The letters had the particular excited register of people in the presence of something they believed would become significant. And then at the bottom of the bundle, a single sheet, same handwriting as the lid inscription, dated October 1893. Development of the spring property suspended indefinitely. Panic of 1893 has eliminated investor interest. Creditors require attention. The spring remains. The documents are placed here for safekeeping. The project will resume when circumstances permit. H.W. Aldridge. She read this, and then she put it down flat on the counter and stood with her hands on either side of it. The panic of 1893 was a financial crisis she had a vague awareness of from American history. It had collapsed banks and businesses across the country. It had ended a great many projects and plans and possibilities. Harlan Aldridge had hidden his records in a wall and waited for circumstances to permit, and the circumstances had apparently never permitted, because the documents were still here in the wall of a cabin in the San Juan Mountains, in a cedar box, sealed with oilcloth, waiting. The spring remains. Those 2 words arrived in her chest with a weight that was disproportionate to their simplicity. She looked at the glass bottle. The liquid inside was clear, slightly golden, caught the afternoon light in the way of water that carries something. She could not open it, could not test it, could not verify anything about it from the bottle alone. But it was there, sealed in wax, preserved a sample from a spring that a chemist in 1891 had called exceptional. The spring remains. If it was still there, if it had not been buried by 100 years of geological change, if the water table had not shifted, if the source had not dried or redirected. If. The documents were the claim, not the proof. The proof was in the ground. Nora sat down on the floor of the cabin kitchen and held the letter from 1893 and looked at the fire she had built in Harlan Aldridge's fireplace and thought. She did not think in the way of someone encountering good fortune unexpectedly, the frantic upward recalculation of possibility. She thought in the way she always thought when facing a problem with multiple components, taking each component separately, assessing it, placing it in relation to the others, building the structure of the situation from its individual parts. The property was hers, legally and completely. The divorce was finalized, and the deed was signed, and the title was in her name. Whatever was on this property was hers. The documents in the box were historical evidence of a claim to a specific natural resource on this property. The claim dated to 1889. The resource, if it still existed, had been assessed by a qualified analyst in 1891 and having therapeutic properties of significant quality. Natural mineral springs with verified therapeutic properties were the foundation of a specific and established category of resort and wellness business. This was not theoretical. She had spent an evening 3 weeks ago in the cabin looking it up on her phone's browser, sitting by the fire with the device propped on her knee, reading about the mineral spring resorts of Colorado, of which there were several, the most famous in Glenwood Springs, in Ouray, and Pagosa Springs. The Pagosa Springs hot springs alone attracted hundreds of thousands of visitors annually. The wellness tourism industry in Colorado was worth billions. She held this knowledge alongside the knowledge that she had $1,700 left in the account Grant had not known about, that her alimony payment had not yet begun and would be modest when it did, that she was 62 years old and had no professional credentials and no business history and no collateral and no network in this industry or any related industry. She placed these two sets of knowledge beside each other and looked at the gap between them. Then she looked at the engineering drawings and thought about a man who had made them in 1892 in the belief that what he was building was worth building. She got up and put the documents back in the box, not carelessly, but with the attention of someone who understands the value of what they are handling. She closed the lid. She carried the box to the loft, which was now clean and dry, and had become the space where she kept the things she needed to protect, and she placed it on the shelf she had built from a piece of planking and 2 pegs. She went back downstairs and sat at the counter and opened her notebook. New page. She wrote spring at the top. Below it she wrote locate, verify, test, document, preserve. Then she began a second list. Research historical preservation grants Colorado. Mineral spring development permits. Environmental assessment requirements. Local historical society contacts. She worked on the lists until the fire needed feeding, and then she fed it and worked on the lists some more. She was not going to tell anyone about this yet. Not Beckett, not Sloan, not anyone. Not because she was protecting a secret, but because there was nothing to tell yet. There was a box in a wall, and old papers, and a glass bottle of old water, and a location on 40 acres of mountain land that might or might not contain what a dead man had believed it contained 130 years ago. Until she had more than old papers, she had only old papers, and old papers were not the things she needed before she told anyone anything. She needed to find the spring. The first week of January arrived with the particular conviction of high country winter, the snow that came the day after New Year's settling in, and declining to leave the temperature dropping into the range where the cold became a physical presence, rather than simply a condition, something you negotiated with, rather than simply dressed against. The cabin was warmer than it had been. The roof repairs had eliminated the wind intrusion. The rechunking she had finished in December had sealed the wall gaps. The fire in Harlan's fireplace ran steadily, and the stones absorbed and returned the heat in the slow thermal cycle she had come to understand and rely on. She had been walking the property every morning since she had found the box. This was partly for her own physical conditioning, which she was attending to with the same systematic attention she gave to the cabin's restoration. Understanding that the work she was doing required a body that could do it, and that the body she had at 62 was not the body she would have had at 42 and would not be improved by neglect. But the walking also served the purpose of learning the land, its contours and features, the way the drainage ran after rain and snowmelt, the places where water collected, and the places where it ran off, the patterns in the vegetation that indicated what the ground was doing below the surface. She had read in one of the books she had ordered from the library in Garrison that natural springs often revealed their presence through thermal effects on the surface above them. In winter particularly, a geothermal water source close enough to the surface would warm the ground above it, And warm ground melted snow differently than cold ground. And if you knew what you were looking for, you could sometimes find the signature of a spring from above. She knew what she was looking for. She found it on the ninth morning of January. She had been moving in a systematic grid pattern through the section of the property that matched the approximate coordinates given in the 1891 analysis documents, moving east from the cabin in rows spaced about 30 feet apart, covering each row slowly and looking at the snow surface with the specific attention of someone who has read enough to know what they might see if they are lucky. She had been at it for 2 hours when she noticed the patch. It was not dramatic. It was not a hot spring venting steam or a clear thermal pool of the kind you saw in photographs of Yellowstone. It was a section of ground approximately 10 feet in diameter, where the snow was thinner than the surrounding ground, and in the very center of the patch, perhaps 18 inches across, there was a spot where the snow had melted entirely, exposing a circle of bare earth in the middle of an otherwise uniformly snow-covered clearing. She walked to it. She crouched at the edge of the bare patch and held her hand above the surface. The difference was subtle but real, a degree or two warmer than the air above the surrounding snow, the specific faint warmth of something below the surface that was not quite inert. She went back to the cabin and got the spade. She dug carefully. The ground was frozen in the first 4 inches, the spade working through it with effort, the permafrost layer that the high country laid down every winter like a lid. Below 4 inches, the ground softened. Below 8 inches, it changed again, the texture of the soil shifting from the dry crumble of frozen earth to something darker and damper, the soil of a place where moisture was present. At 10 inches, the water came. Not flooding, not erupting. Just a slow seep, the water rising into the depression she had made at a steady, unhurried rate, filling the bottom of the hole by inches. She held her hand in it. The temperature was unmistakable. Warm. Not hot, not the dramatic heat of a thermal vent, but the steady, temperate warmth of water that had come up from depth, from the geological warmth of the earth below the frost line, carrying in solution whatever the rock had given it on its way up. She brought the hole up to the surface. She cupped the water in her palm. The smell was there. Faint mineral, the particular sulfate and silica note that she had read about in the chemist's letter from 1891. The smell that distinguished therapeutic mineral water from ordinary groundwater. Not unpleasant, specific. Harlan Aldrich had found this in 1889. He had built the cabin with the intention of returning and developing it. He had hidden the documents and waited for circumstances to permit. The panic had come and the circumstances had never permitted, and the decades had accumulated, and the property had passed through hands that did not know what it was. Grant had inherited it from a father he preferred not to discuss, and had held it for 20 years without ever setting foot on it, and had given it to his ex-wife as a joke, as a final calculated insult, certain of its worthlessness. Nora was kneeling in the snow with warm mineral water on her palm, looking at the bare circle of earth in the middle of a January clearing in the San Juan Mountains. She was quiet for a long time. Then she filled a clean sample bottle from her work bag, sealed it, labeled it with the date and location. She covered the hole with a piece of the planking she had in the work bag for exactly this purpose, weighted it with stones, and walked back to the cabin. She called the geology department at Fort Lewis College in Durango that afternoon and described what she had found carefully and accurately, without interpretation. The department assistant gave her the name of a water testing laboratory in Durango that handled mineral water analysis for commercial and research purposes. She called the lab and arranged to bring a sample. She drove to Durango the following week. The lab results came back 12 days later. Mineral content exceptional. Sulfate, calcium, magnesium, silica, trace iron. The profile was consistent with therapeutic mineral springs of high classification. The lab technician, a methodical woman in her 30s who had clearly written a great many of these reports and remained unimpressed by most of them, had included a notation at the bottom of the standard results sheet that was outside the template added by hand. In 15 years of testing water samples for this region, this profile is in the top 5% of mineral concentration and quality I have encountered. If this is a natural spring source of consistent volume, it has significant commercial and therapeutic potential. Nora read this and sat in the Durango Starbucks where she had been waiting for the email, and she read it again. Then she opened the grant research folder on her laptop and began composing the first of her applications to the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund. She did not call her children that night. She was not ready yet. There was still too much distance between what she had and what she needed, and she had learned enough by now about managing expectations, including her own, to know that the time for sharing was not when you had found the start of a thread, but when you had followed the thread far enough to see where it was going. She drove back up the mountain in the dark, the road that had seemed hostile and uncertain on the first night, now simply familiar, the turns and grades encoded in her hands and her judgment from weeks of daily travel. She parked beside the cabin and sat in the car for a moment, looking at the structure, the lamp she had left on in the main room, sending a rectangle of warm light across the snow from the replaced window. It looked like a home, not a finished home, not a comfortable home by the standards of the life she had left, but a place where a person was doing something, where the lights were on and the fire was going and the work was ongoing, where the evidence of effort was present and accumulating. A place that was becoming something because someone had decided it would become something and had gotten up every morning and worked toward that. She went inside. 2 weeks after she sent the first grant application, she went to Dearborn's store for lumber and roofing nails, and found when she arrived that Dearborn was in conversation with a man she had not seen before, a man who stood with the ease of someone who occupied spaces with the assumption that the spaces were pleased to have him. She gathered her materials and paid and drove back up the mountain and thought nothing more of it. It was Dearborn himself who told her on her next visit that the man had been asking about the Aldrich property. Not about her specifically. Dearborn said, his voice carrying the particular neutrality of someone conveying information they consider important, without editorializing about it. Just about the property. Whether it was occupied now. What was happening up there? He said the man had come in from Denver, had the look of someone doing research rather than someone with a casual interest. Nora looked at Dearborn for a moment. "Who sent him?" she asked. Dearborn shook his head. "Didn't say. But he had a business card. Wexler and Associates." She drove back to the cabin and called the lawyer she had hired in Durango, a woman named Treadwell, who had been recommended by the Fort Lewis Geology Department contact as someone who handled property and water rights matters in the region with particular competence. She told Treadwell about the box and the documents in the spring analysis. She told her about the man in Dearborn's store and the Wexler connection. She told her that Grant Aldridge had been informed through some channel that something was happening at the cabin property. Treadwell listened without interrupting, which was a quality Nora had valued in her from the first consultation. When Nora finished, Treadwell asked 3 specific questions about the timeline of the divorce finalization and the deed transfer and the date the analysis results had been received. Then she said the divorce is final and the deed transfer is complete, and there is nothing in the settlement documents that contains a provision for reopening the asset division based on subsequent discovery of value. Grant Aldridge has no legal standing to claim any interest in this property or any resource on this property. His lawyer can file whatever he wants. It will not succeed. Nora thanked her and ended the call. She sat at the counter with the engineering drawings from Harlan's box spread out in front of her. The bathhouse design, the 3 soaking rooms, the reception area, the caretaker's residence. She thought about the lawyer Treadwell had described. Wexler sending someone to gather information, preparing the approach, calculating the angle. This was what men like Wexler did when they discovered they had left something valuable behind. They looked for the mechanism to get it back. She picked up the phone and called Treadwell again. "What do I need," she asked, "to make this property unassailable? What documentation, what filings, what record makes it absolutely clear that what is here is mine and what I make of it is mine?" Treadwell began talking. Nora opened her notebook and began writing. The following morning, she was at the county recorder's office when it opened. She filed a formal mineral spring claim based on the 1889 Harlan Aldridge registration and her current deed ownership. She filed a water rights notice based on the spring analysis results. She paid the fees, which were modest, and she received the stamped copies, which were not modest in what they represented. Then she drove back to Garrison and went to Dearborn's store. Dearborn was alone. She set the stamped copies on the counter. "If that man comes back," she said, "or anyone asking about the property, you can tell him that the Aldridge spring claim was refiled this morning and the water rights are registered and the deed is clear." She paused. "And you can tell them that the woman who lives there has read everything there is to read about property law in this county." Dearborn looked at the documents. He looked at her. the same flat assessment she had received on the first morning, but this time what was behind it was something different. He nodded once. Fair enough, he said. 3 weeks after she had filed the mineral claim on a Thursday afternoon in February, when the snow was falling in the steady, purposeful way that indicated several inches, rather than a passing weather event, Nora was in the cabin main room, reviewing grant application materials when she heard a car on the track. Not Dearborn, not a delivery, the sound of an engine that was managed and expensive, a car driven by someone who was accustomed to driving carefully through inconvenient terrain rather than someone accustomed to the terrain itself. She put down her pen. The car that came into the clearing was a black sedan that was 3 or 4 years old and had been washed recently. The man who got out was Wexler, not a representative this time. Wexler himself in a wool overcoat that was doing its best against the February cold and not fully succeeding, his silver hair gaining small white caps from the falling snow before he had taken 6 steps toward the cabin. She watched him approach from the main room window. She did not go to the door. He knocked. She counted to 5 and then opened it. He looked at her with the professional pleasantness of a man who operates in contested situations for a living and has learned that pleasantness is more effective than aggression in the opening position. He looked past her briefly at the main room. She watched him register the fire, the repaired floor, the clean walls, the drawings and documents organized on the counter. Wexler, she said, his name not a greeting, Mrs. Aldridge. He said it with the same practiced warmth. I apologize for arriving without notice. I was in the area and thought a direct conversation might be more productive than correspondence. She did not invite him in. She stood in the doorway with her hand on the door and looked at him. The snow fell between them with complete impartiality. My client, Wexler said, has become aware that the property may have been undervalued at the time of the settlement agreement. There are provisions in Colorado law for the revisitation of asset division when material facts were unavailable to one party at the time of the agreement. Mr. Aldridge is prepared to pursue that avenue, if necessary, but he would prefer to reach an arrangement that serves both parties fairly. Nora waited until she was certain he was finished. The divorce was finalized in November, she said. The deed was transferred in November. Everything on this property that exists and everything I have made of it since November belongs to me fully and legally and has since November. There are no material facts that were unavailable to your client at the time of the settlement. He chose his property as an insult. The fact that his judgment was wrong is not a legal provision. Wexler's pleasantness held its shape with the practiced resilience of something that has been maintained through more significant pressure than this. He reached into his overcoat and withdrew a document. If you review the relevant statute, he said, you will find that I have reviewed the relevant statute, Nora said. My attorney reviewed it this morning and found that it does not apply. You are welcome to file whatever you choose to file. It will not succeed. She looked at him steadily. You have my attorney's name from the county records. Any further communication should go through her. She closed the door. She stood inside with her hand on the door and listened to the sound of his footsteps on the snow. The sound of the car door opening and closing, the sound of the engine, and then the diminishing sound of the engine as the sedan moved back down the track toward the county road. She went to the counter and picked up her pen. She wrote a brief summary of the visit in her notebook with the date and the time and the substance of what had been said in the specific way she had learned from Treadwell to document all relevant interactions. Then she called Treadwell and reported it. Treadwell said she would file a formal notice of the interaction and that it was unlikely Wexler would persist the matter further, given the current state of the documentation, but that she would begin preparing a comprehensive brief should it go further. After she ended the call, Nora sat for a moment in the main room of the cabin that had been Harlan Aldridge's and was now hers. She thought about Grant in his office in Denver, reviewing real estate reports and making calculations, and arriving at the conclusion that the thing he had thrown away as garbage was worth something after all. The particular texture of that, the way it would sit in him, that calculation. She did not feel satisfaction about this. She noticed with a specificity that surprised her that she did not feel satisfaction. The calculation of his error was not the point. The point was the engineering drawings spread out on the counter and the stamped mineral claim in the folder on the shelf and the sample from a spring in the ground outside that a chemist had called exceptional. She pulled the grant application back toward her and picked up her pen. That same evening, the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund application was completed. She read it through twice, made two corrections of phrasing, and attached the scanned copies of all relevant historical documents from Harlan's box. She attached the water analysis results. She attached the engineering drawings from 1892, which had been drafted by a named architect, in which the historical preservation contact at the state office had told her in a preliminary email exchange were of considerable historical interest. She sent it. Then she called Beckett, not to ask, not to worry him. She called him because it was Tuesday and they had developed over the past 2 months the habit of talking on Tuesday evenings, a habit that had started with check-in calls in the early weeks and had become something else, longer conversations about what she was doing and what he was thinking, and the kind of exchange that had not been easy to have when they were in the same city and her life was organized around someone else's schedule. He answered and she told him about the spring. She told him about the documents and the analysis and the grant application and the Wexler visit and what she had said and what Treadwell had told her and where things stood. Beckett was quiet while she talked, his thoughtful pause. She was finished and the pause extended. Then he said, "I left a bag of tools by your door in November. Did you find it?" She had known it was him. She had known from the first day. She had looked at the ground and known the quality of the tools inside it and known from that quality who had purchased them and why. "I found it," she said. "I didn't know what to say." He said, "I watched him in the courtroom and I didn't know what to say, and then it was done, and I was standing in the parking garage and I still didn't know what to say, so I just—" "You didn't need to say anything," Nora said. The line was quiet for a moment with the specific quality of a silence between two people who understand each other well enough that the silence is not empty. "Does Sloan know about the spring?" he asked. "Not yet. She's going to be insufferable about having been right about something being there." "She wasn't right about that specifically. She'll find a way to make it fit," Beckett said. Nora laughed. It was a real laugh, the first real laugh she had produced in long enough that the sound of it was slightly foreign to her, a sound from a register she had not visited recently. She said goodnight to her son and sat for a while in the quiet cabin with the fire going and the snow still coming down outside and the engineering drawings on the counter and the stamped mineral claim in the folder on the shelf. The spring was out there in the dark under the snow, doing what it had been doing since before Harlan Aldrich found it in 1889, before the panic of 1893, before the decades of abandonment, before Grant had stood in a courtroom and laughed. Still flowing, still warm, still there. The letter from the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund arrived on a Thursday in May. Nora was on the roof when she heard the mail truck on the track below, that particular diesel sound she had learned to distinguish from other engine sounds over the months of living here. The way you learn to distinguish all the sounds of a place once you had been in it long enough to stop filtering. She came down the ladder carefully, the way she always came down ladders, now with the respect for height that 62-year-old knees demanded, and that she had learned to give without resentment. She walked to the mailbox at the edge of the clearing, the one she had installed herself in March, using a post and a hardware store box and 2 hours of digging in ground that was still partially frozen. The envelope was from a state agency address in Denver. It was thicker than a rejection. She stood at the mailbox and opened it. The Colorado Historical Preservation Fund was pleased to inform Ms. Eleanor Aldridge that her application for the restoration and historical designation of the Hollow Ridge Mineral Spring property had been reviewed and approved for funding in the amount of $47,000 contingent on the completion of an environmental assessment and the formal historical designation process, which the fund was prepared to assist in facilitating. She read it through to the end. Then she read it again from the beginning. The air in the clearing was the air of a Colorado May morning, the specific quality of high country spring, cold still present at the edges of the day, but the sun carrying real warmth in it for the first time in months, the snow gone from all but the north-facing slopes, the ground soft and dark, and beginning to do what ground does when the season turns toward the work of growing things. The aspens along the east edge of the clearing had put out their new leaves small and pale and moving in the light breeze with the particular trembling motion of aspen leaves that always looked like they were responding to something you couldn't quite hear. She stood in the clearing with the letter in her hand and looked at the property around her. The cabin was unrecognizable from what she had found in November. The roof was sound and tight, the new cedar shakes still bright against the old, the ridge beams straight. The walls were re-chunked and sealed, the exterior logs treated and cleaned, the vines removed, and the stone foundation visible and solid at the base. The windows were whole. The porch had been rebuilt, the new planking still blonde against the weathered gray of the original framing. She had preserved the support posts level and plumb. She had replaced the door with a door she had built herself 2 weekends of work, a solid panel door with iron hardware from Dearborn store, hung true and latching cleanly. She had done most of this herself, not all of it. The roof she had done with the help of a retired contractor from Garrison named Prudhoe, who had come up on 2 Saturdays in February and worked alongside her without condescension, treating her as someone who knew what she was doing because she had consistently demonstrated that she knew what she was doing. Prudhoe had the quality of certain experienced tradesmen who assessed competence by watching hands rather than by asking credentials, and what her hands told him had apparently been sufficient, because by the second Saturday he was asking her opinion on sequencing rather than explaining what needed to happen next. Everything else had been hers. She folded the letter and placed it in the interior pocket of her coat, the same pocket where the deed had lived on the drive up in November, the pocket that had held the things she needed to keep close. She went inside and called Treadwell. Then she called Beckett. Then she sat at the counter with the engineering drawings in front of her and the grant letter open beside them, and she began making the list of what came next. The environmental assessment took 6 weeks, conducted by a firm out of Durango that specialized in geothermal and mineral water properties. 2 scientists spent 2 days on the property in late May, taking measurements and samples and core readings, and doing the work of translating a natural phenomenon into the language of documentation that regulatory bodies and funding organizations and eventually commercial development would require. They were professional and thorough and treated the spring with the careful attention of people who understood what they were looking at. The lead scientist, a woman named Vassar, who had studied geothermal systems for 20 years, crouched beside the excavated spring site on the second morning and was quiet for a long time before she said anything. "The source depth is significant," she said finally. "This isn't a shallow perched aquifer. The water is coming from depth, which means consistent temperature and consistent mineral load year-round. The seasonal variation will be minimal." She looked up at Nora. "The consistency is what makes the difference in therapeutic application. A spring that varies with the water table doesn't give you the reliability you need for a commercial operation. This one will." Nora asked the question she needed to ask. "Volume," she said. Vassar looked at her instruments and at the notes she had been making in her field book. "Sufficient," she said, "for a small facility, not for industrial scale, but that's not what this is." She looked at the drawings Nora had brought out from the cabin. The original plan, she said, indicating the bathhouse design. What the man who found it intended. "Yes," Nora said. Vassar looked at the drawings for a moment. "He sized it correctly," she said, "either by calculation or by instinct. He knew what the spring could support." Harlan had been out here with measuring instruments in a geologist's eye and a conviction that what he had found was worth building around. He had been right. He had just run out of time. Nora was not going to run out of time. The historical designation process moved through the summer in parallel with the environmental assessment, the state historical office sending a researcher named Colville, who spent a full day at the cabin examining the contents of the cedar box with the focused reverence of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. The 1889 mineral claim registration was, Colville told her, one of the earlier such registrations in the San Juan region. The engineering drawings from 1892 were, in his assessment, historically significant, the work of a named architect whose other projects in the region were already in the historical record. The property was designated in August. A formal designation, a bronze plaque, and a state registry entry, and the specific protections and funding access that came with it. Nora received the designation documents and added them to the folder on the shelf that had grown from a thin collection of stamped papers in February to something considerably more substantial, the accumulated documentation of a legal and historical identity that no one could now argue with. The contractors arrived in September. She had hired locally the way she had intended from the beginning, workers from Garrison and the surrounding communities who knew the terrain and the climate and the specific demands of building in this country. There were 4 of them, initially a foundation and framing crew, and they arrived on the first Monday of September in 2 trucks with tools and materials in the professional self-possession of men who had been building things in the mountains for a long time. The first morning, she showed them the engineering drawings and the site and her plans for how the original design would be adapted to current code requirements. She showed them the spring excavation and the flow measurements from Vassar's report. She walked the footprint of the bathhouse with them, the staked ground she had measured, and marked herself over 2 afternoons in late August. And she answered their questions directly and specifically the way you answered questions when you had done your homework. One of the men, the senior member of the crew, a man named Gareth, who had been building in this county for 30 years, watched her through this explanation with the assessment that experienced tradesmen applied to clients who were either going to make the work easier or harder. At the end of it, he asked one question. "You going to be here during the build?" "Every day," Nora said. He nodded. That's what he needed to know. She was there every day. Not supervising, not observing from a distance, working. She was not a carpenter, and she was not a mason, and she was not a plumber, and she had no illusions about any of these things. But she could carry materials and move things and hold things in place and do the 100 secondary tasks that speed a construction job and that owners who only appeared for scheduled walkthroughs never understood the value of. She learned from watching what was being done, and she asked questions when she did not understand something, and she did not ask questions twice about the same thing. By the end of the first week, Gareth had stopped explaining what he was doing before he did it and had started asking her to hand him specific tools by name, which was a different kind of conversation entirely. The bathhouse took shape through September and October with the specific rhythm of construction, the days of apparent slow progress where the foundation was being set and the rough framing was going up, and then the days where the building seemed to visibly become itself, where the structure crossed some threshold and you could see what it was going to be. The design was faithful to Harlan's 1892 drawings in its proportions and materials, stone and timber, a low roof line that read as part of the landscape rather than an imposition on it, the kind of building that looked as though it had been there for a long time rather than built last year. The 3 soaking rooms, each connected to the spring source through copper pipe runs that Vassar had specified for mineral water compatibility, each room fitted with a deep soaking tub of carved stone that Nora had commissioned from a stonemason in Durango who had done historical restoration work and understood what she wanted. She made decisions every day. Some of them were consequential decisions about materials and methods, and she made them with the accumulated knowledge of a person who had been present for every step of the process and understood the dependencies between choices. Some of them were small decisions that nobody else would notice, but that she would notice because she was the one who would be here every day after the contractors went home, and she made those decisions with the same wire because the small ones were the ones that determined whether a space felt right or merely looked right. There was a difference. She had known this her whole adult life. She had built a home on Garrison Street that felt right, that made people comfortable in ways they could not always articulate, and the reason it had felt right was that someone had paid attention to the small decisions. That person had been her, and she had done it for a house that was ultimately not hers in the way that mattered. This was hers. Every decision here was permanent in the specific way of decisions made in a place you are going to stay. Garrett's crew finished their portion in early November and left with handshakes and the specific mutual respect that forms between people who have worked alongside each other through a difficult moment and found each other competent. Nora stood in the clearing after their trucks had gone and looked at what had been built. The bathhouse stood against the slope behind the spring site, its roof line continuous with the rocky rise of the mountain behind it, its stone face the same gray granite as the cabin's fireplace. The timber framing of the entrance portico was carved with a simple date, 1889, the year Harlan had filed the claim, the year this had all started. The spring itself was now housed in a small, covered structure that protected the source while allowing access for maintenance, and from the source, the copper lines ran under the ground to each of the 3 soaking rooms. She went inside the first soaking room. The tub was full. Vassar's team had pressurized the system that morning and tested each room, and the tub held the mineral water from the spring at the temperature it came from the earth, approximately 104 degrees Fahrenheit, the specific temperature that the therapeutic mineral bathing literature she had spent 6 months reading described as optimal for the musculoskeletal and cardiovascular effects of mineral immersion. The water surface steamed faintly in the cool November air. The smell was there, that specific mineral signature, the sulfate and silica note that was not unpleasant, but was distinct, the smell of something that came from deep in the earth and carried the earth's chemistry with it. She put her hand in. The warmth was immediate and complete. Not the surface warmth of a heated pool, but the dense warmth of water with mineral content, a warmth that felt like it was touching the inside of things rather than just the skin. She stood there with her hand in Harlan Aldridge's Spring in the Bathhouse, built from Harlan Aldridge's drawings, and she thought about a man who had stood in this clearing 130 years ago and found this water and believed it was worth building around. And she thought about everything that had happened between his belief in this moment, the panic, in the decades, in the accumulated neglect, in the hands that had held the deed without knowing what the deed was for. And she thought about a courtroom in November, and a judge's gavel, and a man's voice saying, "Enjoy the cabin." And she thought about what she had done between that moment and this one. She did not think about Grant in the way of someone accounting for grievances. She thought about him the way you think about a weather event that has passed and left the landscape changed. He had been a force that had moved things. The things he had moved were where they were now, and some of them were here, and here was where she was. She pulled her hand out of the water. She had work to do. The opening was the first Friday of December one year, and 3 weeks from the day she had walked into the cabin for the first time. She had not planned a ceremony or an event. She had placed a small advertisement in the Garrison Community Board and the Regional Wellness Directory and the Colorado Historical Tourism listings, and she had opened the appointment calendar that Treadwell's office assistant had helped her set up, and the first 3 Saturdays had filled within the week. The first clients were a couple from Durango who had found the listing through the Historical Tourism Directory. They were in their late 60s, both of them, and they arrived with the slightly tentative air of people who are not sure what they have found. She showed them the property, the cabin, the bathhouse, the spring site. She explained Harlan's story and the mineral analysis and the construction process. The woman asked questions about the therapeutic properties with the specific interest of someone who had personal reasons for asking. The man looked at the stonework of the bathhouse with the eye of someone who had built things and knew what good building looked like. When they came out of the soaking room an hour later, they were quieter than they had been when they went in, which was what the water did when it worked correctly. That evening, the man came to find her where she was working in the cabin. "Who built the bathhouse?" he asked. "A contractor from Garrison named Gareth," she said. "And me." He looked at her. "You built this. I was there for all of it." He was quiet for a moment. He had the quality of someone choosing words carefully. "It's the best stonework I've seen in this region," he said finally. He paused. "I've been building in these mountains for 30 years. She thanked him. He nodded and went back to his wife. She sat at the counter after they left and wrote the date in her notebook, in the words "first day open," in the number of the first appointment, in a brief note about the water temperature and the system performance. The record keeping was part of the operation. Everything was part of the operation. The regional magazine story ran in January. A journalist named Holt had contacted her in October, referred by the State Historical Office, who had apparently mentioned the designation to their media contacts as an item of interest. Holt had come up in late October and spent a day at the property asking questions that were specific and well-researched questions from someone who had done their homework before arriving. The story ran 6 pages with photographs, the photographs showing the cabin in its restored state and the bathhouse and the spring, and in several of them, Nora at work. She saw herself in those photographs with the slight dislocation of seeing yourself as others see you rather than as you see yourself in mirrors. The woman in the photographs was lean and weathered and standing with the posture of someone who was completely at home in their body and in the space around them. Her hair was silver and pulled back without apology. Her hands in the photographs were the hands of someone who worked with them. She looked nothing like the woman who had sat in a parking garage in Denver 13 months ago watching the clock on the dash. She looked like someone who had built something. The story did not sensationalize the divorce. Holt had handled it with restraint, using it as context rather than drama, describing the circumstances of how Nora had come to the property without dwelling on them. The story was about what had been found and what had been built, which was the story that mattered, and Holt had understood that. The response was immediate and larger than she had expected. Appointment requests came from Denver and Albuquerque and Salt Lake City and Phoenix. Women wrote to her, a great many women who had read the story and wanted to say things to her about it that they apparently needed to say to someone. She answered every letter personally, briefly, because the correspondence was not the work, but the people writing deserved to know they had been heard. And then the other kind of correspondence began. The first letter from Stanhope Development arrived in February. It was addressed to Ms. Eleanor Aldridge, property of historic record Hollow Ridge, which told her that the person writing had done their research. The letter was courteous and direct, the letter of a company that bought properties and was accustomed to making offers that were accepted. The offer was substantial. She read it once and placed it in the folder on the shelf. The second letter arrived 3 weeks later with a revised figure that was 20% higher than the first. She read it and placed it with the first. The third letter came with a phone number and an invitation to a meeting in Denver with a man named Stanhope, first name Frederick, whose biography she had looked up and found to be exactly what the letter suggested: a man who had spent 30 years acquiring properties of value and who had developed a sophisticated understanding of when someone was likely to hold and when they were likely to fold. She called the number. The meeting was in Denver on a Tuesday morning in March. She drove down the night before and stayed with Sloan, who had been following the magazine story and the correspondence in the appointment calendar with the specific focused attention of someone who was very carefully not saying "I told you so," mostly because she had not told anyone so, but felt that the sentiment was implicit in the general situation. Over dinner, Sloan asked her what she was going to say to Stanhope. "I don't know yet," Nora said honestly. "I want to hear what he says first. He'll offer you enough to never work again." "I'm not working," Nora said. "I'm building something." "Those aren't the same thing." Sloan looked at her across the table. "I know," she said. "That's what I'm saying. Don't let him talk you into stopping before you're finished." The meeting was in a glass building in the financial district. Stanhope's office was on the 14th floor, with a view of the mountains to the west that was, she noted with the specific irony of someone who had been living among those mountains for 15 months, considerably less impressive than the view from her cabin window. Frederick Stanhope was a large man in his early 70s, the kind of man who had been physically imposing in his youth and had aged into a different kind of mass, less muscle and more gravity. He had been in rooms full of important people for 40 years, and it showed in the way he occupied space, the ease of someone who had not needed to justify their presence in a long time. He shook her hand with genuine interest, which told her he had read the magazine story, and he gestured to the chair across the desk with the courtesy of a man who believed in conducting negotiations in comfortable chairs. She sat. He looked at her with the direct appraisal of a man who did not consider eye contact a competitive act. "The property has a specific quality," he said. "I've had 3 of my people walk it. The historical designation, the mineral analysis, the location. The wellness tourism market in Colorado is growing at a rate that makes this a significant asset." Nora waited. "The number I put in the third letter," he said, "is a fair reflection of what the property would support as a commercial acquisition. I can go higher, but I want to be honest with you, rather than work through the iteration." She looked at him. He meant this. She had been in enough negotiations over 40 years of managing people and projects to know the difference between courtesy deployed as strategy and the real thing. She said, "I'm not selling." The pause he made was not the pause of surprise. It was the pause of recalibration. "The revenue potential from your current operation," he said, "is limited by the scale of the facility. With investment, with the infrastructure I could bring, I know what the revenue potential is," Nora said. "I've modeled it. What I'm doing there is not primarily about the revenue potential." He looked at her with something that was not challenge but was close to it. "Then what is it about?" She thought about how to say it in a way that would communicate accurately rather than simply. "Harlan Aldridge found that spring in 1889, she said. "He built a cabin there and hid the documents in a wall because he intended to come back and finish what he started. He never came back. 130 years of people owned that land without knowing what it was." She paused. "I know what it is. I built the thing he drew. I finished what he started. That is not something I sell before I understand what I built." Stanhope was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What would you consider?" She told him, "A development partnership. Stanhope's company would provide capital investment for the expansion of the facility, the addition of 2 more soaking rooms, in a modest lodge structure for overnight accommodation. In exchange, Stanhope Development would hold a minority stake 30% with no operational control. All decisions about the property, its character, its staffing, its relationship to the community it sat in would remain with Nora. The historical designation and its requirements would remain inviolable. The Aldridge name on the property would remain. Stanhope looked at the terms she had written out on a single sheet of paper and handed across the desk. He was quiet for a time that was longer than negotiating quiet. It was the quiet of someone genuinely thinking rather than performing the appearance of thought. The 30%, he said, is what the investment is worth at current valuation, Nora said. You can have Treadwell's analysis. It's accurate. He looked at her. You've been talking to Treadwell. I've been talking to Treadwell since February of last year. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was in the same family. Then he extended his hand. She flew back to Garrison that evening in the particular state of someone who has done a difficult thing correctly. Not elated, not relieved. Settled. The specific interior quality of a decision that aligns with what you know rather than what you hope. She called Treadwell from the car to begin the partnership documentation. Then she drove up the mountain in the dark. It was 2 weeks after the Stanhope meeting on a Wednesday afternoon in late March that Grant Aldridge came to Hollow Ridge for the second and final time. She was in the bathhouse conducting a maintenance inspection when she heard the car on the track. The sound of it was different from the Stanhope sedan, and different from the Durango suppliers, and different from Gareth's truck. It was the sound of Grant's car. She knew it. 15 months of separation had not erased the knowledge of the specific engine note of the car he had driven for 4 years. She came out of the bathhouse and stood in the clearing. He had aged. This was her first clear thought when he got out of the car before any other thought arrived. He had aged in the specific way of men who had been running on something that was no longer fueling them. The sharpness gone from his face, replaced by a kind of tired settling. His coat was still good, but it was last year's coat, she could see that. The car needed washing. He stood by the driver's door and looked at the property. She watched him look. She watched his eyes move from the cabin to the bathhouse, to the spring structure, to the carved date above the entrance portico, to the path she had laid through the clearing and the plantings she had put in along its edges. She watched him take inventory of what she had built, and she watched the inventory do its work on his face. He looked at her, she looked back. The distance between them was 20 feet and everything else. He walked toward her slowly, not with hesitation exactly, but with the care of someone who is measuring the ground. Nora, he said. Grant, she said. He looked at the bathhouse again. The stone and timber of it, the way it sat into the slope as though it had always been there. I read the magazine story, he said. He paused. Several months ago, I didn't come then. She waited. I didn't know, he said. About the spring, when I gave you this property, I want you to know that. I genuinely thought it was worthless. If I had known what was here, you would have kept it, Nora said. She said it without accusation. As a fact. He looked at her. Yes, he said. That's probably true. It was honest. She had not expected honesty from him here, and she found that its arrival changed something small in the quality of the conversation. What do you want, Grant? He looked away from her toward the mountains above the property. The expression on his face was one she had not seen in a long time, possibly had not seen since the early years of version of him before the accumulated choices had settled into the person the courtroom had shown her. Tatum left in the spring, he said. Last spring. The business has been difficult. The market shifted, and I made some choices that... He stopped himself. I'm not here for money, he said. Whatever you think I'm here for. I'm not here for that. She looked at him. I came because I wanted to see it, he said. What you built, he paused. And because I wanted to say that I was wrong. About the property, about the things I said about your contribution, about how I handled all of it. His voice was steady, but the steadiness cost him something. You can tell me that my apology means nothing after the fact. You'd be within your rights. Nora considered him. She had thought at various points over the past 15 months about what this conversation would be if it ever happened. She had imagined herself saying things she had not been able to say in the courtroom, the full accounting of 40 years of invisible work and the specific weight of each year. She had imagined the relief of the accounting, the satisfaction of having it witnessed and acknowledged. Standing here now, she found that she did not want to make the accounting. The work she had done in those 40 years had been real, and its value was real regardless of whether it was acknowledged. The spring was in the ground, and the bathhouse was standing, and the designation plaque was on the wall, and none of that required his acknowledgement to be true. She had stopped needing him to see her somewhere in the middle of last winter. She could not identify the specific date, but it had happened, and the freedom of it was quiet and complete. "Your apology is heard," she said. She meant this. Not as absolution, not as the closing of a wound, but as the accurate description of what had happened. She had heard it. He nodded. He looked at the bathhouse one more time. "Harlan would be pleased," he said. "My father talked about him sometimes. His grandfather said he was the only one in the family who had known what to do with this land." Nora looked at the carved date above the portico. 1889. "He knew exactly what to do with it," she said. "He just needed someone to come back and finish it." Grant was quiet for a moment. Then he got back in his car. He drove out of the clearing without looking back, and the sound of the engine diminished down the track toward the county road. And then it was gone, and the clearing was quiet in the specific way of a place that has returned to itself after a temporary interruption. She stood in the clearing for a while after he left. She was not thinking about Grant. She was thinking about what Gareth had said on the last day of the build when they had finished the stone facing on the bathhouse entrance and stepped back to look at it. He had stood beside her with his arms crossed and looked at the work with the critical eye of a man who found flaws before he found anything else. Then he had said, without looking at her, "I've built a lot of things for a lot of people. This is the first time in a while I've built something that was going to last." She had understood what he meant. Not just the quality of the materials or the soundness of the construction. He meant the specific quality of a thing built by someone who intended to stay in it, who had skin in it beyond the investment, who was not building for the market, but for the life they were going to live in what they built. She went back inside the bathhouse and finished the maintenance inspection. The Colorado Business Journal story ran in April. She had not sought this coverage. A business journalist named Harlow had contacted her through the state historical office, following up on the regional magazine story, with the specific interest of a publication that covered enterprise rather than human interest. The Business Journal story was different from the magazine piece in Register and Focus. It was interested in the business model, the mineral rights documentation, the historical designation as a framework for preservation-linked development, the partnership structure with Stanhope, the revenue trajectory. The headline was, "Hollow Ridge Mineral Springs, a century-old claim, becomes a model for heritage enterprise in Colorado." Harlow had done the work. The story was accurate and detailed, and treated what she had built with the seriousness of something that was genuinely worth analyzing. It mentioned the discovery of the Harlan Aldrich documents in the 1889 registration and described the restoration process with enough specificity that readers who knew construction and water rights would understand what the achievement represented. It did not mention Grant. It did not mention the divorce. It was a business story about a business, and the business was hers, and it stood entirely on its own. She received a copy of the issue in the mail on a Friday. She read it at the counter over her morning coffee and thought about Harlan's letter from 1893, the one that said, "Development of the spring property suspended indefinitely. Circumstances do not permit." She thought about what he had intended by leaving the box in the wall. For the family, when the time comes. She had not been Aldrich family when Harlan wrote that. She had become Aldrich by marriage and had stayed Aldrich by choice after the marriage ended, a decision she had made the week after the divorce, because she had been Eleanor Aldrich for 40 years, and she had built something under that name, and she was not going to change it on account of someone else's choices. For the family, when the time comes. She thought he would have considered her family. On the evidence of what she had done with what he left behind, she thought he would have recognized her as someone who understood what he had understood, which was that this land had something in it worth working toward, that the work was the point that you built for the long time rather than the immediate return. She was looking at the article when her phone buzzed. A text from Beckett, a screenshot of the article. Then a second text. "Sent this to Dad." He replied with one word. She looked at the screenshot of Grant's reply. The single word was deserved. She set the phone down. She thought about what that word had cost him to type and send, And she thought about whether it mattered to her, and she found that it mattered in a small, specific way, not as validation, not as vindication, but in the way that a fact that has been a long time in arriving matters when it finally arrives. The way you feel when a calculation you have been running for a long time finally closes. She put the phone in her pocket and went outside. Sloan and Beckett arrived that afternoon. They had not coordinated this, or if they had not told her. And they arrived within 40 minutes of each other, Sloan from Denver and Beckett from Thornton, and they stood in the clearing and looked at the property in the April sun with the expression of people who have been following a story at a distance and are now in the place where the story happened. Beckett walked the path through the clearing, slowly reading the property, the way she had watched him read things since he was a child, with the patient thoroughness of someone for whom understanding and looking were the same activity. He went into the bathhouse and came out and stood in the entrance for a moment before coming back to where she was standing. "You built this," he said. She had been saying yes to that sentence for 6 months. It still required a moment. "We built this," she said. "You left the tools." He shook his head. "I left a bag of hardware," he said. "You built this." Sloan had gone to the spring side, crouching at the edge of the covered structure, and looking at the water in the small observation basin Vassar's team had installed for maintenance monitoring purposes. She was quiet for longer than Sloan was usually quiet. She stood up and turned. "It's warm," she said. "You can feel it from above." "The earth is warmer where the water is close to the surface," Nora said. Sloan looked at her with the expression she had been wearing for the past year, the expression of someone who had expected their mother to survive and had not quite expected her to do this. They sat on the rebuilt porch in the late afternoon, the three of them, while the sun moved behind the western ridge and the shadow of the mountain came down the slope toward the clearing in the measured way that Nora had watched it descend every evening for 15 months. The aspens along the east edge were in full spring leaf, now the pale gold green of new growth, moving in the small evening wind with their characteristic trembling. Beckett had brought a bottle of whiskey from a distillery in Durango, which he had apparently researched specifically for the occasion, and they drank it from the tin cups Nora kept on the cabin shelf with the uncomplicated pleasure of people who are together in a place that feels right. "How did you do this?" Beckett asked. He was not asking about construction techniques or grant applications or water rights filings. He was asking the larger question, the one underneath all the specific answers, the one about how a person gets from November in a Denver parking garage to April on a porch in the San Juan Mountains with a spa on the property and a business in operation and the specific quality of contentment in their face that cannot be manufactured. She thought about the real answer. "I stopped asking whether I was capable," she said. "I already knew the work. I'd been doing work my entire adult life. The only thing that changed was that I stopped doing it for someone else's structure and started doing it for my own." Beckett turned his cup in his hands. "Did you know it would work?" he asked. "When you drove up here in November?" "Did you know?" "No," she said honestly. "I knew I wasn't going to turn around." Sloan looked at the bathhouse in the falling light. "What comes next?" she asked. Nora looked out over the clearing, over the path she had laid, and the spring structure in the bathhouse, and the mountains beyond the tree line showing their serious evening faces in the way of mountains at the turn from afternoon to dusk. "The lodge," she said. 4 rooms. Guests who want more than a day visit." She paused. "And I want to open the historical documentation to researchers. Vassar knows a graduate student studying geothermal systems in the San Juan region. The spring has scientific value beyond the therapeutic application. Harlan knew that. He had the chemist's analysis done." Sloan was quiet. Then she said, "What about you?" "Not the property, you." Nora looked at her daughter. "I'm here," she said. "That's what's next for me. Being here and doing this and seeing what it becomes." She meant it in the simplest and most complete way. Not as a statement about independence or resilience or the reinvention of a life. Those were descriptions from outside accurate from a distance. From inside, from the actual lived texture of the 15 months behind her, it was simpler than any of those descriptions. She had found a place where the work she was capable of matched the work that was required, and she was doing it, and the doing of it was the thing itself. They sat until the clearing was in full shadow and the temperature had dropped in the way of mountain evenings that came on fast, and then they went inside to the fire and the dinner Nora had made earlier in the day, and the lamplight of the cabin, that Harlan Aldridge had built in the mountains in 1889 with the intention of returning to finish what he had started. She washed the dishes after dinner while Beckett and Sloane talked at the counter, their voices, the ordinary voices of family, talking, not performing or reconstructing, but just talking in the comfortable way of people who are in a place where they can be at ease. She looked out the window above the basin at the dark clearing and the darker tree line and the sky above the mountains that was beginning to show its stars one by one. The way stars in the high country always appeared ahead of schedule and in greater number than anywhere else she had ever been. After Beckett and Sloane had gone to their rooms in the loft, she put on her coat and went outside. The night was cold and clear and absolutely still. The stars were present in the specific, overwhelming abundance of a high country night in spring, the Milky Way, visible in its full extent above the gap in the ridge to the south, the kind of sky that people in cities did not see and could not quite believe until they were standing under it. She walked the path through the clearing to the spring site. She crouched at the edge of the observation basin and held her hand over the surface. The warmth rose against her palm, steady, consistent, the same temperature it had been in January when she had first found it, the same temperature it would be in August, the same temperature it had been in 1889 when Harlan Aldridge had crouched in this same clearing with his hand above this same ground and understood what he had found. She put her hand in the water. The warmth was immediate and complete, the mineral water doing what mineral water did when you gave it the chance, reaching through the skin with the slow, penetrating warmth of something that came from deep in the earth and carried the earth's deep heat with it. She stayed there for a while with her hand in Harlan's, spring in the dark and the cold, and the enormous quiet of a mountain night in April with the stars overhead and the cabin behind her and the bathhouse to her right and the aspens along the clearing edge making their small night sounds in the slight movement of air. She was not thinking about Grant or the courtroom or the parking garage or the November drive or any of the specific events of the past 15 months. She was thinking about Harlan's letter. The spring remains. For the family. When the time comes. The time had come. She had come. The spring had been waiting, patient and warm and unchanged for someone to come back and finish what had been started. And she had come and she had finished it, and it was not finished yet because the good work never finished. It only became the foundation for what came next. She pulled her hand from the water and stood up. She looked at the stars. She looked at what she had built. Then she walked back to the cabin, to the fire, and the warmth and the sound of her children sleeping in the loft of a building that had stood in these mountains for 135 years and would stand for 135 more. She went inside and closed the door, and the night settled back into its silence, and the spring flowed on in the dark below the clearing, warm and steady, and entirely itself as it had always been, as it would always be.